We turn to Philippians chapter 3 now, and verse 13. Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let us therefore, as many as are perfect, have this attitude, and if in anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal that also to you. However, let us keep living by that same standard to which we have attained. Now, in verse 13, Paul says very clearly that he has not yet laid hold of it fully. He had already said in verse 12, not that I have already obtained it, that is, the resurrection from among the dead, or that I have already become perfect, complete, that is, partaken of all the fullness of God that there is in Christ. No, he hadn't partaken of it. And he says the same thing. In fact, 3 times in verses 12 and 13, he says that he has not yet achieved all that he wanted to. He's not yet obtained. He's not yet become perfect. He's not yet, verse 13, laid hold of this prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Now, all these verses indicate that there was something that Paul was training forward to, that absolute perfection that there was and that there is in Jesus Christ. He had not yet attained to it. We are told very clearly in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2, we shall be like him when we see him. But until that day, we are told in 1 John 3:3, we are to purify ourselves just as he is pure. Now there, John is saying exactly the same thing that Paul is saying here, that we have not yet become like him. We become like him when we see him. That perfection that there is in Christ, we shall have only when we see him face to face. But now we can have another perfection, and that Paul speaks of in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 15. He says, let us who are perfect have this attitude. Which attitude? The attitude of pressing on to perfection. But he says, let us who are perfect press on to perfection. What does that mean? In one verse, verse 12, he says he's not yet perfect, Philippians 3:12. In verse 15, he says he numbers himself among those who are perfect. Obviously, he's speaking about 2 different perfections. Even though it's the same word in the Greek language that he uses, yet it's 2 different perfections. Perfection in 2 different areas. In verse 15, he's speaking about being perfect in our conscience. This is what the law could not lead a man to. In the book of Hebrews, we are told very clearly that the law could not make a man perfect. Hebrews 9 and verse 9. That the law could not make the worshipper perfect in conscience. But grace has come to make him perfect. Hebrews 10:1. The law, since it was only a shadow, could not make perfect those who draw near. But grace and the gospel can make a man perfect in his conscience. In other words, consciously he is free from committing sin. He does not do anything that he knows to be contrary to the will of God in his life. That's what Paul says concerning himself in 1 Corinthians in chapter 4. In 1 Corinthians and chapter 4, Paul says, I am conscious, verse 4, of nothing against myself. Yet he says, I'm not acquitted, because the one who examines me is the Lord, and he sees many things in me which I'm unconscious of. And this is the perfection that Paul speaks of, the perfection in our conscious life. Now, John speaks of it in other words. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, he says, we become like Christ only when we see him. But he says, we are to walk as Jesus walked right here on this earth. Now, the walk of Jesus was a perfect walk. And we are told in 1 John 2:6 that we can have the same perfection in our life. Now, walking is a conscious act. We don't walk in our sleep or when we are unconscious. We walk consciously. We take steps consciously. And when it speaks about walking as Jesus walked in 1 John 2:6, it refers to that entire conscious area of our life where we can follow in the footsteps of Jesus. But when it speaks about becoming like him, being refers to the total area of our personality, the unconscious part too. And there we shall be like him, 1 John 3:2, only when we see him. So in other words, we walk as Jesus walked and purify ourselves as he is pure, 1 John 3:3, till the day we become like him completely in every aspect and area of our personality, including our conscious and our unconscious areas. Now this is exactly what Paul is speaking of also in Philippians 3. He says, I have not yet become perfect. Verse 12. But one thing I do. Paul was a man of one thing. His greatest ambition in life was not to preach the gospel all over the world, not to have all the gifts of the Spirit, not to become great and famous in this world or to accumulate money or any such thing. He says, one thing I do, and only one thing. And this is where Paul stands out as different from so many believers today. He had one ambition in life, and that was to lay hold of all the fullness of God that there was in Christ, to partake of the divine nature in every aspect of his personality. He knew that this was the greatest privilege that any created being could ever have. The greatest privilege that God can give us, dear friends, is not to preach the gospel all over the world, or to become great or famous even in Christian circles, or to accumulate material wealth. The greatest thing that God can give us is his own nature, to make us loving like he is loving, to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, to good to those who hate us. That's far greater than preaching the gospel across the world. To be humble as Jesus was humble, that's the greatest thing. To be pure as Jesus was pure, this is the greatest thing, and this is what Paul pressed on towards. He said, one thing I do. Of course, he did travel around the Mediterranean preaching the gospel and suffered for Jesus' sake physically too. But the greatest thing that he was seeking for was to partake of God's nature. And he pressed on towards this goal, keeping his conscience perfect. He says in Acts 24 and verse 16, he says, I work hard towards having a blameless conscience at all times, towards God and towards men. That was possible. It was not possible under the old covenant, but now that we are under grace, it says in Romans 6:14, sin shall not have dominion over you because you are not under law now. You are under grace, and we can be perfect in our conscience if we live under this waterfall of grace at all times. And if we keep ourselves perfect like this, then we can press towards the goal, forgetting how far we have achieved and pressing forward, recognizing that we are still so much unlike Jesus in many other aspects of our life. And Paul says, let us who are perfect, let us who are perfect in our conscience and mature like this, have this attitude. So what is the attitude of the mature Christian? He is aware of how much he has yet to become like Jesus. Now let me say that again, because this is the mark of a mature Christian. He is not thinking of how much he has become like Jesus already. He's not thinking of how much better he is than other Christians who are inferior to him. It's immature Christians who think like that. The mature Christian is the one who is conscious of how much unlike Jesus he still is, and is pressing forward to become more and more like Jesus, forgetting how much he has already achieved, forgetting how much he has progressed into the likeness of Christ already, and therefore never foolishly comparing himself with other believers. He desires to become like Jesus in every aspect of his personality, and he knows he hasn't become like that yet, and so he presses towards that goal. And it says here in verse 15, if you have in any area a different attitude, God will show that to you. Is God showing you that you have a different attitude? Well, then there you can judge yourself and follow Paul's example. He says in verse 17, brethren, join in following my example and the example of those who walk according to this pattern. This is the way to godliness and to partake of all the fullness of God that there is in Christ.